Yes, yes, yes. It's Raphael Dawkins, Combat Radio, with another one. And today, we're talking about the Wilder Act. But before we get into that, let's set this thing up properly. There have been rulings which have seen major changes in sports. Two which come to mind are the Ali Act, which proposed to make boxing promoters more transparent, make boxing safer, and contracts fairer. And before that, we saw the Bosman Act, which meant that every European football player was free to negotiate deals with any other European team after their current contract had expired. Now, in light of recent events, perhaps it's time for the Wilder Act. Let me explain. Wilder was made $100 million offer, which at first he appeared inclined to accept. His words were, "I've got to think about my family. I run 2 households. I've got a big family I've got to consider. I've got to do what's right for me." Those were Wilder's words. But after he had a sit down with his handlers, Al Heyman, his so-called advisor, and Shelley Finkel, his manager, after he had the sit down, he came out whistling a different tune. So clearly, they talked him into a different frame of mind. Gone was the "I've got 2 households." Gone was the "I've got to think about my family." Gone was the "I've got to do things for myself now. I've got to think of myself." That was all gone. And it was replaced with the term loyalty. Loyalty. Okay. So what exactly was he referring to with loyalty? Loyalty to whom? It seems he's got it mixed up. Now, the Wilder Act would ensure that any boxer who was unsure about a contract would have an impartial body, advisors they could turn to, they could show contracts to, someone or a body which is impartial, which could look at 2 contracts, talk the fighter through it, so that the fighter could establish which contract was the best for his long-term goals. You see, the long-term goal for any fighter has to be stability, has to be security for when they retire. You see, any sportsman's life is relatively short. There is only a small window of opportunity, a very small window. And so it behoves the fighter to choose their advisors very, very carefully. very, very carefully, because a sportsman's life is a short one. And so it is imperative that the sportsman makes as much as he can, as quickly as he can, as safely as he can. Because they have a long period of time comparative to other professions in retirement. So they have to think long term. This is where the Wilder Act comes into play. With the Wilder Act, the impartial body will give impartial advice and guidance. And so this talk about loyalty can be put into perspective. Of course, loyalty is an admirable trait, but you've got to think about the long term. You've got to think about the long term and what's best for you and your family. Those other guys can still get their little cut. Might only be 10%, but 10% is better than nothing. You can still be loyal to them in that way. Break them off a chunk of change. But you've got to make sure that you secure the big bag. Now, back in the dizzy, we have to look at deals that were made that proved to be unwise. Let's look at the Beatles deal. Let's look at the rookie mistake made by the Beatles. The Beatles manager Brian Epstein was a 30-year-old furniture salesman when the Beatles hit America in 1964. When he was approached by a savvy Nick Byrne to license the Beatles' name and likeness for various novelty products and toys, he firmly stated, this is Epstein firmly stated that he would not accept a penny less than 10%. Nick had difficulty at the time hiding his surprise, as the typical range for such licenses was between 30 and 50% of the product's price. Mr. Byrne quickly signed dozens of agreements with merchandisers that subsequently cost the Beatles approximately $100 million in lost royalties. Mr. Epstein later renegotiated the Beatles share to 45%, but by then the Beatlemania was on the wane and the financial damage had been done. So once again, Deontay, you have a short window of opportunity to make it count. So I implore you to think very, very carefully about what you're doing. That's why we need a Wilder Act. We need a Wilder Act quickly for the sake of Deontay Wilder himself. It's Raphael Dawkins, Combat Radio. Like, subscribe, comment, and share. And I'm out.